So, who is Elvis Costello? Is he the herky-jerky, new wave, Buddy Holly lookalike nerd behind such hits as Pump It Up and Oliver's Army? Is he the wannabe intellectual, trading in a life of pop stardom for tasteful collaborations with the likes of Alain Toussaint and Burt Bacharach? Or is he that semi-recognizable geezer who keeps popping up in Austin Powers, the Spice Girls movie, and late-night American talk shows? He is, of course, all of these things, but notable in that after having his 15 minutes of pop fame by 1980, he was able to turn his least marketable attributes into a successful 4-decade-long career. I'm talking about his overly verbose and literate lyrics, his inherent unsexiness, at least according to pop standards, and finally, his willingness to dip his toe into just about any genre or even any discipline that has taken his fancy over the years. On paper, Elvis Costello is an incredibly unlikely superstar. An Irish Catholic with a Protestant work ethic, for all his career missteps, you could never accuse him of not putting the work in. With his semi-northern, semi-transatlantic accent, he is equal parts a Scouser as he is a Londoner, and having mostly turned his back on the UK, has become something of an honorary American in his late career. Of course, getting older and maturing is a very difficult thing for any artist within the pop idiom. If the breakup of the Beatles in 1969 taught us anything, it's that while, as individuals, they could retain a degree of cultural cachet as men in their 30s, their time was well and truly up in more ways than one by 1980. The 1980s were particularly cruel to artists of the classic rock era. The Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, and Neil Young in this decade seemed somehow untethered from the earth, veering drunkenly from genre to genre, from producer to producer, in search of the ever-elusive mid to late career hit. Fortunately for them, the 1990s revitalized their careers, even if, like the Rolling Stones, they could only trade more or less exclusively on the memory of their classic era. Even today, with McCartney, Dylan, and the Stones touring well into their 80s, it's pretty easy to forget that these are the first people ever really to do this at this level, to play rock and roll music at this age, a genre defined by its very youthfulness. I remember when my grandfather died in his mid-70s. Sure, part of it was a lifetime of harsh Australian sun, but he nonetheless looked like a dried up old prune. Evidence of a life well lived. McCartney and Jagger are now about a decade older than that and are still playing 3-hour stadium shows. And Paul famously doesn't even drink water on stage. Aging gracefully is a difficult thing for anyone, especially for those living their lives in the public eye. And given our collective cultural misogyny, it's perfectly understandable that female rock icons like Joni Mitchell and Grace Slick effectively turn their backs on the business after reaching a certain age. And it will certainly be interesting to see how modern pop artists navigate this same problem themselves as we try to look beyond the overly and overtly sexualized pop aesthetic of the 21st century. For a 32-year-old Elvis Costello in 1986, Bob Dylan's 1975 album Blood on the Tracks may well have stood out relatively alone as what could have been considered as a mid or even late career comeback. Like for Bob Dylan, incidentally around that same age in 1975, the combination of declining cultural relevancy, middling commercial fortunes, and the breakup of a marriage precipitated a particularly purple patch for Elvis Costello. This is Blood and Chocolate, for my money, Elvis Costello's very best album. And why this premium on youth anyway? Why couldn't your 11th album, a full decade into your career, not be considered your very best? Now, a lot of people simply don't like Elvis Costello, and it bothers me deeply. What's wrong with him? He's had a very long and successful career, and yet I still think he is massively, massively underrated. His songs are great. His voice is great. His lyrics are incredible. People have suggested to me that he's perhaps just a little bit too clever, too knowing, and I can kind of see that point. Nobody likes the clever clogs. A few people have mentioned to me their criticisms of his voice, and I appreciate that his early vocal sound in particular has a really compressed and toppy quality about it, with a very specific punky appeal and a sonic narrowness, as opposed to his late career, where his vocal technique is characterized by a very close microphone technique. And in the minds of some, the overuse of tremolo, which is to say, fluctuations in volume rather than pitch. On his first 4 or 5 albums, EC has a very choked, mid-range frequency affectation to his singing. And I do say affectation deliberately because I strongly believe that his voice, alongside his name and his image and the lyrical content of his songs, are both very true to himself as a person, as well as being very, very deliberate, even put together, you could say. Like Bob Dylan, he has the physical capacity for his voice to sound any number of ways, but he established his career by projecting a certain vocal quality, so it only stands to reason that he would maintain that consistently throughout. Famously, Bob Dylan's voice changed very dramatically for a handful of early 70s albums, something he attributed to having had quit smoking at the time. But I know just as well as you do that that's simply a lie. He messed with the formula, realized the error of his mistake, and quickly reverted back to being the Bob Dylan we all know and love. And there's nothing wrong with that. So for 1977, EC's vocal style, in my view, is perfectly appropriate in its energy, its attitude, and its edginess, cutting through perfectly as a relatively unglamorous looking angry young nerd within the climate of punk rock. And it's worth noting as well, EC's relative unsexiness having limits to his appeal as a pop star. A good friend of mine, Eleanor Levy, who among other things was the one-time editor of the Record Mirror, told me that she, as a teenager, never got into Elvis Costello simply because she didn't fancy him. Sex sells whether we like it or not. Costello's distinct lack of sex appeal perhaps even sets him apart from others, to the point where you could argue that he was a pioneer in this way. The aesthetics of punk music allowed a lot of bands and artists to get away with a lot, presentation-wise, perhaps not unlike the glam rock of the early 70s, which, let's face it, was mostly hairy old musos slapping on a bit of makeup in the wonderfully camp British tradition. I mean, Dave Hill, I would definitely kick him out of bed as far as I could. I would also add that when I quote-unquote discovered Elvis Costello myself in my mid-20s, I did spend several years basically trying to be him. Part of this was aping his rapid-fire delivery, the angry, sardonic lyrics and posturing, but for the most part, it was about identifying with something other than the classic rock aesthetic that I had grown up on, and embracing at least a degree of modernity. I started playing music in the post-grunge but pre-indie era, where everyone was still hanging their guitars around their ankles and sort of cosplaying as a 1970s cowboy of some kind. In Australia, let's not forget, this was the time of bands like Wolfmother and Jet, if anyone remembers them. It's all a bit anachronistic and embarrassing now, to be fair. For me, Elvis Costello made it okay to write short, tight songs, have a short haircut, wear your guitar high up on your chest. I was so enamored by this style at the time that I was frankly unable to recognize that I had missed the new wave revival by at least a decade, and that electropop and dream pop were really where the culture was at the time, at least then and there. In retrospect, my Elvis Costello obsession probably hindered rather than helped me from finding my own true voice. But then again, that's not unusual for music makers and is really just part of the process of growing up, as far as I'm concerned. Plus, people can usually rightly identify when you're just copying something from the past, and people often did. Nevertheless, I have consistently always returned to his music, and I find it incredibly satisfying to listen to in a way that I couldn't compare to any other artist. I don't like all of his albums, and to be fair, neither does he. But Elvis Costello is someone who always has something interesting to say and is therefore always worth the time of day, in my view. So Declan McManus was born in London in 1954 and raised in the capital as well as Liverpool. Elvis Costello's origin story was that he was a pen pusher in a cosmetics factory who wrote songs in his spare time, which is true, but ignores the fact that he was born into a very musical family and indeed a very long musical tradition. Only by reading his excellent autobiography, Unfaithful Music and Disappearing Ink, did I come to appreciate just how much his trumpet-playing father, Ross McManus, raised him in an environment steeped in music of all kinds. Like a young Bob Dylan, Elvis Costello developed an encyclopedic knowledge of 20th century music of all genres and a dedication to honing his craft. Now, Elvis Costello came out of the British pub rock scene of the 1970s, which was as adjacent to the punk movement as it was to 1950s rock and roll and country music. And it somewhat amused me that he grew up idolizing groups like CSNY while totally rejecting the bombast of heavy rock groups like Led Zeppelin. And in a sense, he was lucky in that the punk rock aesthetic left little room for things like instrumental virtuosity. A rule, of course, which doesn't apply to vocalists. Snottiness, attitude, and energy are the hardest things to inject into a vocal performance. And I would put Elvis Costello up there with Johnny Rotten as one of the best punk rock singers going. But regarding his roots, like his contemporary Joe Strummer of The Clash, he was more or less a chancer when it came to his relationship to punk rock. In fact, I'd go so far as to say his first album, My Aim Is True, is little more than a bunch of country rock songs sped up to sound more punky. And as we found out later in his career, his roots did indeed stretch back even further to big band, country, and even classical music. He even learned at around the age of 40 how to read and write music for the first time, which to my mind is an incredibly impressive and nerdy thing to do. And I mean nerdy in the sense that he was a musical obsessive, like many of us, but his public persona leaned into and perhaps even popularized the nerd aesthetic, a mantle subsequently taken up by groups like Weezer in the 1990s. So alongside changing his name from Declan McManus to Elvis Costello, it also meant putting on a pound shop suit jacket, turning his feet inwards, and playing a Jazzmaster guitar that was just slightly too big for him. His wordy and acerbic lyrics stood out in contrast to the inarticulate and dumb working-class simplicity of his punk rock contemporaries. He further leaned into the angry young man trope, supposedly carrying around a little black book with a list of all the people who had wronged him early in his career. Recorded hastily with Clover, the band later to become The News out of Huey Lewis and The News, 1977's My Aim Is True is a brilliant album hindered by poor production. It sounds lo-fi and not in a particularly good way. The playing of the band is also not quite there in terms of forming a sonic persona around the character of Elvis Costello. Now that your picture's in the paper being rhythmically admired. A great first line and the world's introduction to Elvis Costello. And My Aim Is True does indeed contain quite a few classics in, of course, Allison, Red Shoes, and my personal favourites in Blame It On Kane and No Dancing, a song which contains a standout example of a middle eight key change. No dancing when they get home. He's getting down on his knees, he finds that the girl is not so easy to please. After all his nights is just a paper strip tee. She caught it like some disease. And he says, no dancing is gonna be Another signature song from this period is, of course, the immortal Watching the Detectives. It fantastically showcases Costello's ability to set a scene with his lyrics and explore the emotional, dramatic, and sexual tension between men and women so often observed in his songs. Nice girls, not one with a defect. Cellophane shrink wrap so correct. Red dogs under illegal legs. She looks so good that he gets down and begs. She is watching the detectives. Oh, it's so cute. She's watching the detectives. Oh, and they shoot. They beat him up until the teardrops start. But he can't be wounded 'cause he's got no heart. So after he finally pulled together the attractions, including Bruce and Pete Thomas, no relation, respectively, on bass and drums, plus the incredible classically trained Steve Naive on keyboards, they finally struck upon a distinctive new wave sound, firstly being overly trebly and punchy sounding drums, the Vox Continental organ, and it's through the combination of production and singing technique that Costello was really able to hone his vocal sound with his breakthrough 1978 album, This Year's Model, with its hit singles, I Don't Want to Go to Chelsea, and of course, the Subterranean Homesick Blues inspired Pump It Up. So as I already mentioned, I spent a significant period of my 20s trying to be Elvis Costello, namely aping his rapid-fire wordplay and just the way he pitches his voice generally. Aside from being really fun to sing, it's also really high energy. Part of that choke sound that he has is that he's constantly bracing his diaphragm and letting slightly less air escape than you might expect from singing. As a result, you're constantly in this red-faced, head full of steam mode. She's been a bad girl, she's like a chemical. Though you try to stop it, she's like a narcotic. You wanna touch her, you wanna talk to her. All the things you buy for her, could not get a temperature. Pump it up till you can't feel it. Pump it up, don't really need it. So while it's still a really loud way to sing, it in many ways conserves your vocal cords for when you want to hit those really high notes. It's about the muscle in your core. I read a really interesting interview with Todd Rundgren talking about how he took a long time to really learn how to sing properly, and it's mostly about strengthening that muscle by singing for hours and hours at a time. So perhaps for people on tour, you become maybe hoarse and worn out through singing all the time, but your body becomes very used to doing it nonetheless. And one of the things I love about Blood and Chocolate is just how hoarse Elvis Costello sounds on it, yet he's clearly having no trouble hitting any of the notes. It's a mature vocal style, and in his hands at least, it has enough grit and power and energy in it for it to pass as punk rock. Now, I've stolen the title of this section from the excellent podcast Chart Music. If you haven't heard of that, check it out. But what it refers to is this particular phase of Costello's career where he was regularly accused of misogyny. Now, there is a lot of naked hatred and resentment in his songs, directed at both men and women alike. But considering the nature of his nerdy persona, it's only natural that so much of his ire is directed at women. And for one, I think he's usually targeting specific people rather than women as a whole, for the most part. I would also argue that he's very often writing in character, which leaves space for the idea that many of these songs are indeed critiques of male attitudes and things like standards of female beauty and behaviour as well. This Year's Girl is a great tune that captures some of this attitude on This Year's Model. You see a picture in 1,000 places, 'cause she's this year's girl. You think you are on little pieces of this year's girl. Forget your fancy manners, forget your English grammar, 'cause you don't really give a damn about this year's girl. Hoping that she's well spoken, 'cause she's this year's girl. You want her broken with her mouth wide open, 'cause she's this year's girl. And in response to specific criticisms of this song, he had this to say: everything in the song is about the way men see women and what they desire from them. If there's a lie being told, then it is the one that a girl might be prepared to live or tell in order to live up to some false idea of attraction. While I think some of the objectification of women in these songs lands uneasily on modern ears, I do think by scratching under the surface just a little bit, you can see far more nuance in these lyrics. Therefore, I think it's a bit lazy to jump to accusations of misogyny in Elvis Costello's case, although I'm happy to be convinced otherwise. After all, I'm not going to pretend to speak to the lived experience of women. So moving on, Costello widened his focus on 1979's armed forces to use interpersonal relationships as a metaphor for geopolitics, critiques of Western imperialism and fascism, and vice versa. Spawning the classic singles, Oliver's Army, and my personal favourite, Accidents Will Happen, a song unusual for Elvis Costello, at least for me, in that I find it really difficult to work out the chords and what's happening harmonically. Again, utilising Nick Lowe as producer, Armed Forces really solidified the band's sound and represents Elvis Costello's commercial peak. This year's Model and Armed Forces are held up by many as 10 out of 10 examples of Costello's imperial phase, and people are not wrong to argue that. So I'd like to ward off any criticism that I don't believe these are perfect albums, because they are. But I also think Blood and Chocolate is perfect. So it's a testament to this man's genius that he has so many albums that could be considered his best. At least 5 10 out of 10s, in my view. I could have easily made this video about Trust, Imperial Bedroom, or even 2002's When I Was Cruel. He really is that good. So that aside, while America fell in love with Elvis Costello in 1979, his steamroller tour of the USA in that same year came to a dramatic halt when he did a racism. Which is to say, he drunkenly employed a nasty racial slur in what could only be described as an outrage contest in a hotel bar. Now, I'm not particularly interested in talking about this incident because when you look into it, it appears to be little more than a admittedly regrettable mistake and not really evidence of any kind of deeply held racist viewpoint that Elvis Costello held or holds. Most of us, at one point in our lives, have used regrettable language in order to trigger a reaction, or in the moment it felt amusing for whatever reason. I, for one, look back on my teenage years and cringe at how frequently the homophobic F-slur was thrown around in my social circle. And like many of these things, this shame and embarrassment should be turned into an opportunity for learning and self-improvement. After all, we're all works in progress and we fail the final exam of life. However, it is interesting to think that had this incident not occurred, Costello's career may have taken a very different trajectory. Bruce Springsteen is often seen as Costello's American counterpart, as another Dylan-esque wordsmith jumping on the latest trend as a springboard to worldwide superstardom. But frankly, Bruce is too good-looking, too everyman, and in my opinion, too one-dimensional for an artist like Costello to even bother emulating. So while the incident did provide something of a circuit breaker in his career, firstly doing penance by embracing black music for 1980's excellent Get Happy, the hugely underrated Trust, and the first of his many genre experiments in the mostly unloved country covers album Almost Blue. 1982's Imperial Bedroom announced Costello as a fully grown-up artist, singing about grown-up issues with a grown-up sound and no longer attempting shiny pop music. I have at various times considered Man Out of Time as my number one favourite Elvis Costello song. He's got a mind like a sewer and a heart like a fridge. He stands to be insulted and he pays for the privilege. To murder my love is a crime, but will you still love a man out of time? Almost everything he writes has a hidden depth or double meaning, so that this song, on the face of it, is about a political scandal and a murder, but it could easily be also read as a song about self-disgust and the strains of a romantic relationship. As a live entity, in 1982, I would argue that Costello and the Attractions were at an absolute peak in terms of set list and pure energy, and it's a bit sad that I can't find more recordings or bootlegs of this period. So after this followed a few albums that, to my mind, marked the end of Costello's Imperial phase, and tensions within the Attractions caused him to branch out into his very first solo albums with other bands, basically, despite him already being considered in the public consciousness a solo artist for the most part. Which leads us up to 1986 for their reunion on Blood and Chocolates. So it's perhaps fitting that artists of the early rock and roll generation never really had the opportunity to mature at all. The Army killed Elvis's career, the Church killed Little Richard's career, Prison killed Chuck Berry's career, Underage Girls, Scandal killed Jerry Lee Lewis's career, Underage Girls and Incest, and of course, Gravity killed Buddy Holly's, sadly, in a literal sense. As a result, these artists never really had the chance to grow up, and if anything, they went on to simply play the hits for the rest of eternity. Songs about cars, girls, school, and other teenage concerns. Considering how essentially adolescent early rock and roll really is, to do otherwise would have been, frankly, ridiculous without completely changing style. So anyone who came up after the Beatles were basically the first generation of musicians to be around in the popular culture long enough for their careers to require second acts, as it were. The Who and the Stones, for example, both became completely different bands in the 1970s compared to how they first shot to fame. And it would make sense that men in their 30s would be writing songs about things that concern people also at that age, namely liberal politics, social dynamics, depression, suburbia, and of course, the complexities of adult relationships. Divorce albums became somewhat in vogue in the 1970s for this reason. I mentioned Blood on the Tracks, but there were also Rumours by Fleetwood Mac, Born to Be With You by Dion, Here My Dear by Marvin Gaye, and to be fair, just about the second half of ABBA's entire discography. So often what makes divorce albums is a shared middle-agedness, a sort of sad and beaten tiredness combining extremes of love and hate, desire and disgust, longing and apathy. The kind of self-pitying and self-flagellation that only people with lived experience of a difficult relationship can truly understand. Rock and roll is a perfect vehicle for capturing teenage horniness and will she won't she trepidation. While adult music, or music for adults, has always existed in one form or the other, until the 70s it was a million miles away from rock and roll aesthetically. But boomers inevitably had to grow up as well. So Blood and Chocolate is merely another album along that continuum, normalising the exploration of adult themes in popular music. Getting married is the easy bit. Staying married or getting a divorce is very, very hard, as I understand it. And these are some of the many reasons why adulting sucks. That said, I do have a handful of friends who have been through divorces usually in their early 20s after fairly short marriages. And in my observation, that experience tends to imbue them with a sort of wisdom and world weariness that is actually quite a cool energy. Personally, I've always been in long-term relationships and have a natural aversion to drama of any kind. And while I might fairly successfully project a sunny, friendly persona, I don't mind saying that in many ways I fall short, both as a husband and as a human being. Don't we all? In my experience, adult relationships are all about accepting each other's foibles, whatever they may be. Surely, most of you would agree that any relationship where people don't occasionally butt heads is frankly a bit weird. And the emotional themes conjured up in the songs of Blood and Chocolate very much pertain to my experience of marriage in all of its extremes. Love and hatred, lust and revulsion, lingering resentment, ignored or forgotten indiscretions, obsessive jealousy and casual indifference. All of these emotions are present in Blood and Chocolate. On top of that, it also hints at themes of betrayal. Olivia Harrison, George Harrison's wife, famously said that the secret to their marriage was that they simply never got divorced, which is her coded way of saying that she tolerated his infidelities. And maybe that's the price you pay for being married to one of the most famous people in the world. Sure. And regardless of whether we think that's a good or a bad thing, it is something that lots of people do. Humans are capable of appalling behaviour, and more so compartmentalising that behaviour in themselves and in others as a survival mechanism. And while it is hard to sympathise with philanderers generally, I see little utility in passing judgment on others until you have the chance to walk in their shoes. If you were a world-famous musician, do you think you could really resist having beautiful men and women throwing themselves at you from dawn till dusk? Thankfully, I, and most likely you also, rarely have the limits of our morality tested in this way. And let's not forget, the price that so many of our cultural heroes pay for their success is having to live their lives in the public eye. Who would want that? So it comes with the territory that Elvis Costello is playing the hard-done-by, spurned lover with a chip on his shoulder. But between the lines, there is much in his songs to suggest that he is indeed the one in the wrong much of the time, and that we're only really hearing one side of the story. Accidents Will Happen is directly about an adulterous relationship he had with B.B. Buell in the late 70s, and he has gone on record to say that he routinely plundered the drama of his personal life for songwriting subject matter. In a word, it's spicy. So Blood and Chocolate's theme of interpersonal conflict is one that was carried through the album's production as well. The attractions themselves were all quite pissy, as on top of living in each other's pockets on tour for almost a decade at this point, which should get on anyone's tits, earlier in 1986, EC had recorded King of America, a very shiny, produced, very 1986 sounding album with a bunch of crack American session musicians in a very controlled setting. By contrast, to record Blood and Chocolate, EC and the Attractions set up in the live room at London's Olympic Studios, eyeball to eyeball, where they deliberately performed as few takes of each song as humanly possible so that they wouldn't have to spend even a moment longer in each other's company than was absolutely necessary. And it sounds like it. They brought in the legendary Nick Lowe to produce, the man behind the band's breakthrough late 70s records, for what was clearly intended to be a return to their earlier sound, playing at top volume, complete with fold-back monitors that they would typically use on stage. So this equates, of course, to a lot of bleed between the instruments and therefore less opportunities for overdubs. Famously, Nick Lowe's production approach on this year's Model and Armed Forces was to have them bash out the songs and polish it up later. And Blood and Chocolate is very much in keeping with this decidedly un-1986 approach to recording. It really sounds like a bunch of blokes in a room. It's absolutely electrifying. Blood and chocolate, hope you're satisfied what you've done. Already, he's put the title of the album in as the first line of the song. It's not even a song, it's like a warm-up, a prelude, a scene setter, a statement of intent, a raw, unvarnished serve of bile. With the production already, you can hear immediately how garagey the band sounds. And in the context of 1986, this was the furthest thing from what you'd expect to hear. It's far less keyboardy than his earlier sound. The guitar's quite distorted throughout, and you can tell immediately with his vocal sounds, at least to my ears, that he is singing into a dynamic microphone like a SM7 or whatever, or a 58, that you might do if you were performing live with a band and not in a studio per se. And you can hear that mostly in the plosives that pop through in the sound. The lyrics of Uncomplicated seem like they are addressed to a lover, perhaps his wife. Not a lot of poetry as of yet, and nothing compared to what is to come up on the album. Indeed, it's uncomplicated. Track 2 with I Hope You're Happy Now actually brings us in to the album proper. And if the lyrics of this song are speaking directly to his wife, then I Hope You're Happy Now has to be the bitterest song I've ever heard. He's acting innocent and proud, so you know what he's after. I love the way the band bursts in after the stops in the song. Just explosive energy of the band here. And again, you can tell they're playing in the room together for the most part, not just because of the band sound, but because the way his vocals are so imperfect, or at least by the standards of what we've come to expect. Every time he hits a P or a B, you can hear the plosive in the microphone, the kind of thing that would, in an ordinary context, would be edited out immediately or re-recorded. You can hear that especially during the line in the bridge where he says, you'll soon put pay to that. The pay, it's almost ugly sounding by the standards of pop. The refrain, if I knew then what I know now, I never loved you anyhow. It's vintage Costello, bitter and twisted, and I'm here for it. Track 3 is Dylan-esque Tokyo Storm Warning. Already the energy in the band is palpable, comes in with an infectious drum beat. The album is front-loaded with these high-energy rhythmic workouts that make you want to bounce off the walls and tear up the joint. And all underneath these tumbling verses that just pour out of him. You can hear the strain in his voice as he just pushes against the band. Japanese got Jesus, robots telling teenage fortunes. For all we know and all we care, they might as well be Martians. They say gold paint on palace gates come from the teeth of pensioners. They're so tired of shooting protest singers that they hardly mention us. While fountains fill the second-hand perfume and sodden treading stamps, they'll hang the bullies and the louts to dampen down their day. Why do we care if the world is a joke? We'll give it a big kiss, we'll give it a poke. Death wears a big hat, cause he's a big blow. And it goes on like this for 6.5 brilliant minutes. Can't get enough of it. And then finally on track 4, we're slowing down a little bit, catching our breath with, of course, Home is Anywhere, You Hang Your Head. We're well into the meat of the album now, with this man down in his cups, Mr. Misery himself. His voice is clearly hoarse and you can hear the imperfections in it. Someone this sound reminds me of is Nick Cave, who doesn't have a voice anywhere near as strong as Costello's. However, he's kind of made it his thing. Even now, he records his records live with the band. And that sound that you get from being imperfect and maybe hoarse and maybe tuney at times gives you this human quality that perhaps you don't hear much anymore. The world has wiped its mouth since then. Maybe it was yawning. You can hear him kind of half smiling or grimacing through the lyrics. And it's got one of those lovely kind of pedaling outros that I really like, where the band gets a little time to breathe and show off their chops a bit. Now finally, we are at the centerpiece of Blood and Chocolate, I Want You. Where do you start with a song like this? It's iconic, it's famous for all the right reasons. It wasn't a single, it wasn't featured in a movie, at least as far as I know. It's notorious for just being incredible. And if you went to an Elvis Costello show and he didn't play I Want You, you'd surely feel shortchanged. Personally, I'd feel more shortchanged than if he didn't play Pump It Up or Oliver's Army. So starting with the title, I Want You, it's a cliche in and of itself. We already have Beatles songs, Marvin Gaye, Bob Dylan, putting out songs of this title. And I mentioned Nick Cave before because Nick Cave did a whole album where he took overused phrases for song titles and gave them a new life, which I think is a great approach. So at its essence, I Want You is a torch song, but rather than just being a song about just throwing yourself at the mercy of the one you love, this takes the concept to a perhaps logical, extreme conclusion and could be read as a stalker's manifesto, if not a straight-up murder ballad. So there's quite a bit of lore around the recording of it as well. Like with the other tracks on the album, they were all playing in the same room, although according to legend, the other elements of the band gradually disappear and you're left by the end of the song with just the vocal mic and everything else is just atmosphere and bleed. I find it hard to tell if this happens at certain spots or gradually throughout the song, but it enhances the evil intimacy of this song. Oh, my baby, baby, I want you so it scares me to death. I can't say anymore that I love you. Anything else is a waste of breath. And then bam, all of the humor is immediately sucked out of it and we're brought front and center into this psychodrama. I want you, you had your fun, you don't get well no more. I want you, your fingernails go dragging down the wall. Careful, darling, you might fall. So that each line of each verse begins the same way, I want you, and he gradually fills in the colors of his relationship, becoming more menacing as it goes. And it's the allusions to sex that are particularly disturbing to me. It's the thought of him undressing you, or you undressing. So it's not just the idea of her being with another lover, it's the idea of her even having herself to herself, having any kind of bodily autonomy at all that drives him to madness. There's also this very Neil Young style, two-note, tritone guitar solo, illustrating his inner turmoil. I want you, I'm not ashamed to say I cried for you. I want you, I want to know the things you did that we do too. I want you, want to know he pleases you more than I do. I want you, I might as well be useless for all it means to you. It's a major cuck energy there. Quite disturbing. And in some live versions that I've heard, he sings that a whole octave higher just to up the drama. Then the band simmers all the way down again, and we're back to the first verse. He's shot his proverbial or literal wad at this point, and he's back in his natural state of seething exhaustion. And as I say, the rest of the band kind of disappears and we're just focusing in on the intimacy of the vocal. I want you every night when I go off to bed, and when I wake up, I want you. And there you have it. Elvis Costello has been called out for being unable to write a true love song before. To my mind, this is his version of that. This song is the form that his love can manifest itself in. It's just not conventional, and it's speaking to a love perhaps so intense that it becomes somehow murderous, like he wants to physically crawl inside her body and wear her skin as a suit. We've all been there. I mean, my wife even likes this song, and I feel if you can't be moved by it, then you probably wouldn't be moved by anything. Okay, and now we're into side 2 of Blood and Chocolate with Honey, Are You Straight or Are You Blind? A bit of a palate cleanser after I Want You, a return to a perhaps simpler 12-bar blues musical form with an ambiguous lyric about jealousy, either because his current lover is in love with his ex or has fallen in love with a woman or something. And the lyrics would be quite fun to actually spit out as he does in this high-energy song. The next track is Blue Chair, a fairly highly regarded Costello classic and one that you see in his setlist quite a lot. And in all honesty, I don't love the keyboard sound in this song, nor do I like the chorus particularly. I do really like the bridge in this song with its kind of backing vocals and the rather obvious reference to the Beatles' Anna with the bit. Then track 8 we have Battered Old Bird, another attempt at a ballad on Blood and Chocolate. Unlike I Want You, it is more of a character study in the tradition of Eleanor Rigby or some other such McCartney ditty, and perhaps a step away from the other tracks on Blood and Chocolate in that it is less about you and me and more about them over there. A really sympathetic and perhaps humanist portrait of a boarding house and the characters that dwell within it. The vocals in the verses are pitched really quite low for Costello standards. And on the first floor, there are 2 old maids, each one wishing that the other was afraid. And next door to them is a man so mild, till he chopped off the head of a visitor's child. He danced upon the bonfire, swallowed sleeping pills like dreams, with a bottle of sweet sherry that everything redeems. There's a cool key change into the last verse and some interesting backwards production effects going into the outro. I should say there are some great live versions of this song out there as well, where the intro just goes on and on and on forever. Steve Naive has this very distinctive keyboard sound that kind of strikes like a slow motion clock. Crimes of Paris is a cute little pop number with some interesting chords in it. And now it's always another day, just after 12 o'clock struck. And then the chorus as well. You're not the girl next door or a girl from France, the cigarette girl in a scissor hot pants. All the words of love seem cruel and crass when you're tough and transparent as armor glass. You're an everywhere girl in an everyday mess, who'll pay for the crimes of Paris. And he's got his wife's, his soon to be next wife, Kate O'Riordan, singing backup vocals. Then leading, of course, into Poor Napoleon, which also features her vocals in the chorus. Spoken word style over the music, which personally reminds me of Badfinger's No One Knows, which is perhaps a slightly obscure reference. And she's just repeating the title of the song, perhaps invoking this kind of victim complex that he's displayed throughout the album. Of course, Napoleon Dynamite being his adopted persona for this album as seen on the record cover, and later on rehashed again for to take on tour. There's quite a weird bass solo in it, and the song itself is quite highly produced, unlike the rest of the album, which to my mind recalls Imperial Bedroom quite a bit. And then finally into the final track, Next Time Around, which conversely sounds quite underproduced and cacophonous to my ears. And while not my favorite track exactly, it's certainly not filler, because Elvis Costello does not do filler. And to my mind, lyrically, is something of a sign-off, a kind of see you later at the end of what is a very bitter and heartbroken masterpiece in Blood and Chocolate. And that's it. The album cover itself features a painting by Elvis Costello under the pseudonym Napoleon Dynamite, linking, of course, to the song Poor Napoleon. He used this alter ego as the master of ceremonies for his spinning songbook tour many years later, and the name also inspired the 2004 film of the same name. So Blood and Chocolate went on to become Elvis Costello's lowest selling record in the UK and in the US, and his last record for Columbia. And to this day, he has continued to make occasionally brilliant and occasionally not so brilliant albums. I mentioned before that 2002's When I Was Cruel is a particular favourite of mine, a record that tries and for the most part succeeds to introduce Costello to the trip-hop and alternative rock generation. And 2004's The Delivery Man, which is his take on a southern rootsy Americana concept album. An honourable mention also goes to 1994's Brutal Youth, for which I also have a soft spot. He still continues to tour almost constantly despite a fairly recent health scare, although he is nowhere near as prolific recording-wise as he once was. I haven't heard all of his records of the last decade or so, but I suspect there is something of value on all of them. Moreover, Elvis Costello has definitely cemented himself as an elder statesman. At this point, there is not a single accolade or prestigious gig that he hasn't won. Going into acting, writing, TV show hosting, conducting, you name it. He married jazz singer and pianist Diana Krall in 2003 and has since mostly lived in the US of A. So there you have it, folks. Blood and Chocolate. One of Elvis Costello's many 10 out of 10 perfect albums, but perhaps one that's been unfairly lost in the shuffle. And in all honesty, I have a favourite Elvis Costello album for every day of the week. But on balance, I think I've got the most mileage out of this. It's packed with great songs, with great performances from an artist at the top of his game. Growing Up never sounded so good, or at least never sounded so interesting, so sardonic, cathartic, bitter, twisted, and ultimately life-affirming.